Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Josh Wachtel, and I'm the Communications Director for Building a New Reality. And we're really excited to have you today at this webinar, Expanding Restorative. So last spring, Ted Wachtel, the founder of Banner, wrote a new paper entitled Expanding Restorative, a sequel to Defining Restorative, which he presented in Tallinn, Estonia, at the European Forum for Restorative Justice conference there. And we've been very excited to have this paper released on the Banner.Foundation website. And you can read it there, you can download it, and we want it to be shared widely. So we're excited to have this first in our four-part series this fall of 2024. We're going to do 4 webinars. This is the kickoff, one each month, and we're just pleased to have you here. And, this is going to be a rolling registration. So if you're signed up for this, you're going to be on tap for the next 3 webinars, and you're free to invite new people to join us as we go, and hopefully we can really share a lot of these exciting ideas. What we're going to do here today is Ted Wachtel is going to present first and share some of the key ideas in his new paper, especially some of the new ones that help to expand the restorative practices continuum and embrace some parts of what's happening in the world that we feel are really parallel to restorative practices, and hopefully will form alliances to grow this movement that so many of us are involved in. So Ted will speak, and then we're going to have Linda Kligman, the president of the IIRP Graduate School. We're so happy to have her. She's written a new book, Heartstrong Work, and is going to be presenting on some of those ideas of how workplaces can be conceived as a restorative community and what that looks like. And then thirdly, in the first half hour, we'll have Terry O'Connell, the author of the Real Justice conferencing script, and has done so much work since the very beginning. It's 30 years since Ted and Terry met, and so it's great to have him back with us from Australia, commenting on some of his views on expanding restorative over the last 30 years and going forward. And then
Well, the first time I expanded the concept of restorative practices was back in the 1990s when Terry O'Connell, who pioneered the Restorative Justice Conference, visited our schools and group homes for delinquent and at-risk youth that my wife Susan and I established here in Pennsylvania. He pointed out that what we were doing was more than simple restorative justice because we were informally and proactively dealing with wrongdoing all day long. So we came to describe these strategies as restorative practices, which include the use of formal conferences, but rely more heavily on small conversations and circles to build and maintain a strong sense of community. For example, before going on a field trip with students, we routinely brought them together in a circle and asked them to imagine what could possibly go wrong on this trip, and what might you be willing to do to keep that from happening. These kinds of community building conversations create a positive feeling of belonging and cooperation that surprise many critics who believe that only rules and punishments work to get compliance from challenging young people. The original restorative continuum illustrates the range of practices that have expanded far beyond positive developments in criminal justice. Restorative practices have also shown their efficacy in family and treatment settings, schools and other institutions, and workplaces. However, in recent years, I've learned about participatory processes, such as community processing, and citizens' assemblies that reliably operationalize problem solving and conflict resolution on a larger scale that could ever be done or accommodated in a circle or formal conference involving hundreds and sometimes thousands of participants. So, like most people, I'm dismayed by the growing political dysfunction in democracies around the world and by the complex disputes that plague our businesses, institutions, economies, and whole nations. And might these new processes serve to widen the scope of the restorative practices continuum from micro to macro so that we can address wrongdoing, resolve conflicts, and make challenging decisions at every level of society. So, my most important learning uh, in recent years is that all types of restorative practices, no matter how large or small, establish emotional bonds among the participants. Restorative processes provide people with an opportunity to express themselves honestly, even when in disagreement with others. Civility is possible because when people express their negative emotions in a safe setting, that immediately reduces the intensity of those feelings. Whether in a classroom incident between two children, a workplace circle, or a citizens' assembly deciding an emotional policy issue, people are more cooperative and more likely to bond when they feel heard. In September 2017, Oprah Winfrey convened a contentious meeting of voters from Western Michigan, 7 Clinton supporters and 7 Trump supporters, to discuss their political differences. And despite difficult conversations, when Winfrey reconvened the opposing groups a few months later, they had socialized and developed friendships. Frank Luntz, the pollster who chose the group members, remarked, "What I liked about it is that they came to respect each other, appreciate each other." In Facing the Demons, an Australian documentary film about a restorative conference, the parents of a young man who had been murdered in a bungled armed robbery reached out to the mother of one of the offenders after the conference. They thanked her for attending, despite the shame she felt for her son's role in the crime, and established a relationship where none had existed before. Psychiatrist Donald Nathanson, the late director of the Tompkins Institute, explained that it's through the mutual exchange of expressed affect that we create emotional bonds that tie us all together. Free expression of affect while minimizing the negative and maximizing the positive is a blueprint for building community. So, what problem are we trying to solve with restorative practices? What are we trying to restore? Well, historian Noah Yuval Harari, in his best-selling book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, argues that the most momentous social upheaval to ever befall humanity was the collapse of the family and the local community, and their replacement by the state and the market. He wrote, as best as we can tell from the earliest times, more than 1 million years ago, humans lived in small, intimate communities, most of whose members were kin. They glued together families and communities to create tribes, cities, kingdoms, and empires. But families and communities remained the basic building blocks of all human societies. The Industrial Revolution on the other hand, managed within little more than 2 centuries to break those building blocks into atoms. Jürgen Habermas, the eminent social theorist and philosopher, described this upheaval as the colonization of the life world by the system. He juxtaposed the two words, life world and system, to represent two competing but related explanations of how society operates. The system is modern society with its administration, laws, politics, economy, organizations, and paid professionals, while the life world is the network of relationships among family and friends who, unlike those in the system, look out for each other, not because they are paid, but because they care. Habermas has long asserted that the modern system of governance and enterprise has pushed aside and diminished the life world of family, friends, and community. On the other hand, from circles to citizens' assemblies, restorative practices bring meaningful life world conversations and relationships to system settings. A friend of mine was skeptical until she experienced her first circle with others in her workplace. She exclaimed that she learned more about her colleagues in that one circle than she had during several years of working with them. In another setting, a family group conference eliminates the need for the government to take a child out of her home because the extended family builds a plan that satisfies concerns for the child's well-being. A simple morning check-in circle at work or school can, for example, help others understand why you are having a bad day and allows them to adjust and support you. A participant in a national deliberative poll said the experience didn't change his political views, but he learned to understand people with opposing positions. He still keeps in touch with one Trump supporter whose views, he says, were softened by the event. Sam Kainer, author of Facilitator's Guide to Participatory Decision-Making, said that the key differentiating factor in the success of any organization is not just its products and services, not just its technology or market share, but the organization's ability to elicit, harness, and focus the vast intellectual capital and goodwill resident in its members, employees, and stakeholders. That's what restorative practices do. They elicit, harness, and focus our collective intellect and goodwill. And that's what we'd like to try to do here at Banner. Thanks, Josh.
All right. Thanks, Ted. All right. So at this point, I would like to invite our next panelist. This is Linda Kligman, president from the International Institute for Restorative Practices Graduate School. And she is going to be presenting specifically around the workplace issues that she's discussed in a new book. All right. Take it away, Linda.
Well, thank you so much. And it's an honor to be here today and serve as the president of IRP, which was founded by Ted and Susan Wachtel. And let me just put my screen on so you can tell you a little bit about how I got here. When I started at the IRP, my background was running a community development organization. When it came to the IRP, one of the things that really stood out to me was how decisions were made. And I've always been curious how people learn how to share their power. And while I was at IRP and learning restorative practices, one of the key differences was I started seeing myself not just as a professional, but in relationships to my family, as a mother, as a daughter, in my community. And that framework was really, really powerful. And I went on to study how workplace leaders use restorative practices. And some of the findings that I have, and from many of the things that I've learned from my years talking to other practitioners, many of whom I see in the chat, so it's so nice to see you, are encompassed in this book, Heart Strong Work. And the reason I called it Heart Strong Work is because when we talk about emotional bonds and when we talk about feelings and affect, it very often gets mistaken as sentimentality, as if caring about something is a weakness. In workplaces, to be professional, you don't have feelings. Feelings are seen as contagions to be kept out of the workplace. But that wasn't what I found when I was doing my research. And what I found instead is that we needed different ways of looking at this work. And the heart as a metaphor, doing this work that comes from our heart, requires a lot of strength. It's not about, sentimentality or Valentine's lacy kinds of thing. It's about real strength. And so Heart Strong Work is based on how we're built, our bodies. And our heart is our strongest muscle. You probably remember learning that at some point. What it does is amazing. It defies gravity. It pushes 2,000 of gallons of blood up to your head with, just by pumping, by coordinated pumping. And what I find really interesting about this is it is about how the heart is structured. And I think that so much of our relationships come from how we are structured. So many of our other muscles are designed to send messages through our nervous system up to our brain. Message goes to brain, brain comes back down and says, move hand from hot fire. Our heart has a very different structure. It's called myogenic. So it doesn't have to send messages to a brain or a singular leader. The way that it contracts and sets your pulse is by having all the muscle fibers overlap. They're not connected, but they touch each other and they send pulses back and forth. And that is what allows our heart to beat. That is our heartbeat. It's this overlapping structure, this entwinement. And when you think about it, the heart has complex valves. Half of the heart is sending, blood to the lungs, half is sending it out to your body. It's bifurcated, right? Half is red, half is blue blood. Very much, if you're American, red and blue bifurcation is the thing right now. So how do we structure something so divided so that it can pump, so that it can regulate pressure, so that it can be successful? And what we found is that synchronizing these efforts is really this heart strong work and principles that restorative practitioners were using to build our relational muscle. And that's basically how the book is organized, is how do we build our relational muscle? And how do we build the courage to connect with each other and stay connected? So the first principle in this book is vulnerability. And as a professional skill set, this wasn't one that I was taught when I was being mentored growing up. Vulnerability wasn't a prized principle. But what restorative practitioners, I think, are very skilled at using vulnerability. They are skilled at using affective statements. This is how they create those emotional bonds that Ted was referring to. So in the first chapter, I talk about the importance of building courage to be known, to say what's really on your mind, to share feelings so that you can create some empathy, emotional impact. And data shows that this psychological safety, this willingness to take a risk, to say something that might be hard to say, to raise doubt, to raise responsible concern, psychological safety is crucial for generating new ideas. You have to be safe to say something that is different. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But the other thing that, Ted hit in on his original defining restorative was the importance of that self-regulation. We all have feelings. They are going to show up. We are going to be embarrassed when we make a mistake. We are going to get angry at people. We're going to feel more akin to some people than others. But how do we self-regulate so that we can minimize the negative and maximize the positive so that we can create more resilient relationships? And just to say, having emotions, it can be messy. And we'll talk about that because there are, specific ways that we can learn how to deal with those emotions at workplace, but they're really, really valuable. And I'll be showing you why. The second principle that came up when I was talking to practitioners, and again, let me say what my research was around workplace leaders who use restorative practices, not just with their clients or students or people coming before them in their courts or prisons, but intentionally using restorative practices with their peers, with their coworkers. And what was most meaningful to many of them was the fundamental hypothesis that Ted wrote when he started the International Institute for Restorative Practices, this concept of being with, how we show up so that we're presenting ourselves not as thinking that people are objects that need to be managed or controlled or ignored, or objects that need us to save them and provide them the way, but to engage with people as subjects who are expert in what they know because they have their own wisdom. So this with metaphor that became shorthand for how do we show up and be truly participatory was profound in workplaces using restorative practices. Participation became the lifeblood of organizations. That was what they expected. That's what they focused on. And that was what allowed them to deal with emotions and still engage with people. The third principle that came up in this study was the importance of catalyzing engagement. And when we catalyze engagement, we're focusing on the acts of inclusion. So Heifetz, who studied leadership, says focus is the currency of leadership. And what these leaders focused on were acts of inclusion. And every workplace leader used dialogue circles for proactively, not just when harm occurred, but they proactively used circles so that people that they worked with were able to find their voice, decide for themselves how vulnerable they want to be, self-regulate what they shared, but allow themselves to become known. So what they recognize is you cannot mandate someone to love their job. You can't mandate them to work harder or be smarter or anything like that. But what you can do is intentionally create conditions where people can bring out the best selves and build relational bonds that are meaningful to them. And what was significant about the restorative circle in the continuum, you can have, more informal conversations. But we tend to have those informal conversations with the people that we work most closely with. So maybe it's between the supervisor employee, the people we sit next to. So someone who has your same role, could be someone, you drive in with, or you commute with. But the purpose of a circle was to build those social networks. So we value relationships, not just in the one-to-one, but we're intentionally building a social network where those feelings of emotional bonds can be shared and can be distributed across the whole organization. That's that relational musculature, right? That it isn't just individual, but a network that can coordinate together. So giving people opportunities to speak for themselves, say what's true and real to them and has meaning, was what built those relational connections and that relational muscle. And this all comes together in my chapter around catalyzing engagement. And so workplace leaders were using very intentional practices, such as affective language, using circles, creating opportunities to structure with participation. And they did that to build mutual accountability. But when they were vulnerable and they were able to talk about what was hard, what was challenging, what was getting in the way, why they weren't, they're able to accomplish what they hoped to, when people were vulnerable and holding themselves and others to account, that builds trust. You know that there's honesty, there's transparency about what's working and what's not. And the active engagement allowed that trust to be spread throughout the organization, but it also allowed people to feel like they belonged and that they had a vested interest in stewarding the outcomes of the organization. And I refer to this grounded theory as widening circles. And those of you who are restorative practitioners probably have heard this term over and over again. And when we widen the circle, we're physically stepping back. We're making room for others to join us. It is a physical act of inclusion. And that was what differentiated workplaces that were implementing restorative practices. And what we found was this research made people feel good, but there's also tremendous bodies of work that says this work is important because those relational connections allow us to coordinate efforts. They allow us to do good. It has better outcomes. We know that engagement increases worker satisfaction, reduces employment turnover. But there's a great body of work in group creativity that links relational connections to creative outcomes. And it starts with the ability to self-manage, to be able to make relational connections that we can feel safe with each other and take risks and try new things. Innovation requires trying many new things that won't work and they won't work in front of others. You will fail in front of others, but you need that dignity to take a risk and feel safe doing that. Any kind of creative process, you need lots of different perspectives, cognitive difference, life experiences difference, ways of thinking are different. You need difference in any organization. You can't all do the same thing, but you need to be able to have connection with each other so you can learn from each other. And if you create what, in defining restorative is defined as shared learning, those group learning experiences are what allow organizations to thrive and create more innovative workplaces. So I'll conclude just saying in my book, this is mostly what I talk about is explicit principles that I've learned from other workplace leaders. And I think what you'll also find in here is a lot of really good stories of what it looks like in higher ed, K through 12, prisons, legal systems, as well as some real clear examples that people have shared with me and given me permission to share about how to structure meetings, how to structure more complicated circles, how to create group norms. So hopefully you will find something useful if that's a thing that you're curious about. And I'll stop here so that Terry can go next. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Linda. Yeah, it's great to see how, the processes and the thinking around all this are evolving. And so many of the points you bring forward in your book are really great to hear. So, and I put the link also in the chat if people are interested in that book, and we'll ask Linda about sharing her slides towards the end here. But next, I'd like to invite Terry O'Connell to come on to screen. And Terry is one of the pioneers of this whole restorative practices, restorative justice area. And I'm really excited to hear what his reflections are. Meeting Ted 30 years ago this year, I realized as I was preparing for this. And so much water under the bridge and so much further places to go. So Terry, are you able to share your video now? Take it away, my friend.
Thanks, Josh. Good morning, or should I say good afternoon. It's 3:30 a.m. here, Thursday morning, down under. I have to be honest, I was so excited about being part of this webinar that I sat on the end of the bed and waited for the alarm to go off this morning. It was meant as a joke. When I first met Ted in June 1994 in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, never imagined for a moment how our meeting would influence the trajectory of each of our lives. Ted and Susan were visionary leaders who felt mainstream schooling had nothing meaningful to offer those young people at the margins, decided with great courage and commitment to create a learning experience that provided voice and validation to so many vulnerable young people. I was not surprised when TED extended the restorative practice continuum to include community processing and citizens' assembly, as I viewed this development as a significant addition to the continuum, because it deals with issues of governance, something that ultimately influences what sort of society we live in. It's not my intention to describe what these participatory processes have to offer, but rather to explore why my Doylestown presentation appealed to TED. Understanding why TED, and no doubt each of you, were attracted to all things restorative, will, I hope, provide an important insight into what I believe is restorative's untapped potential. Ted wrote about our first encounter. During Terry O'Connell's presentation, I was seized by an epiphany, a sudden intuitive realization that I had just encountered an essential universal truth. Conferencing was so simple that it was elegant, so basic that it was complete. Why was this so? What did Ted mean by intuitive? What does this suggest? What was I really offering Ted, and what was new or different? By the way, these are rhetorical questions which I was told yesterday do not require an answer. In his opening remarks, Ted shared a comment I made when I visited his schools. I pointed out that his staff were informally and proactively dealing with wrongdoing all day. What did I mean by that comment? What does this acknowledgement suggest? I'm reminded some years ago of something that Professor Don Nathanson said to me when we were in deep discussion about the innate nature of affects. Don said, "Terry, it's as though we didn't know how to copulate until sex therapists came along." What was Don suggesting about relationships? When Ted and Susan developed their own schools in the 1970s, they already had a well-honed sense of the importance of relationship in teaching and learning. Ted, with others, developed tough love, an approach that offered parents an explicit way of engaging their children using respectful dialogue while balancing expectations and support. Simple as that, and it worked a treat. So something happened when Ted heard me talking about restorative conferences that affirmed what he already knew to be true, the primacy of relationships. Yet for Ted, I was offering him something new and different. What was it? I must confess I'm terrible when it comes to answers, as I'm much more comfortable asking questions. What was your reaction or response when you first heard about restorative justice or restorative practices? What appealed to you and why? The answer to these and other questions is to be found in yet another question. What matters to you? Excuse me. I remember being on a panel, a selection panel for the Youth of the Year, and each panel member was required to ask a question. Mine was, what matters? Each of the 8 finalists who presented individually stopped and commented, "What a great question," and then proceeded to answer, "My relationships matter." Why do relationships matter? Because we're social beings, hardwired for connection, and derive our identity from our relationships. Our need to feel valued and loved is what gives life sense and meaning. Our whole socialisation involves learning how to build and strengthen connections. Relationships are innate and often largely intuitive. My assumption, which I happen to know to be true, is that most of us know how to build and sustain healthy relationships most of the time. I suggest Ted's intuitive sense of relationship was validated in our first meeting because I offered an explicit way to explain why the restorative conference practice worked. I'm not suggesting for a moment that this is how Ted interpreted our first encounter. It wasn't. Instead, as a result of our meeting, Ted's mission was to replicate conference facilitation processes by offering large trainings throughout the world, something he and Susan managed successfully to do over the next 2 decades. However, there's much more to what I was offering. Unfortunately, in my view, the restorative movement has focused on what restorative has to offer rather than where restorative fits within existing practice. The former fails to interrogate the practice void, the latter articulates restorative as germane to mainstream practice. What a mouthful. The former fails to interrogate the practice void, the latter articulates restorative as germane to mainstream practice. Let me explain using a brief history lesson. I'm often asked, what was it about you as a cop that allowed you to develop a conference script and restorative questions? The mistaken belief is that I replicated the New Zealand family group conference process. I first heard about the New Zealand development in early 1991 when John McDonald spoke in Wagga Wagga. I'd not seen the process, nor did I have any insight into the protocols or practice. The truth is that I had an intuitive sense of good process. It was in my DNA. It was at the core of what I believed. I spent the previous year, 1990, facilitating circles for my 15 staff of young police so they could make better sense and meaning of policing and what making a difference involved. Finding better ways of dealing with juvenile crime was our priority. Respectful processes were a strong characteristic of how I police. My first informal restorative process as a 22-year-old rookie cop was in June of 1973 when I was assaulted by Gary, 14-year-old male, as I was attempting to restrain him following a fight in a community hall. I ended up taking Gary to his home, and the following day met with Gary and his mum at the police station. We sat in a small circle, and using open-ended questions, I was able to understand the why of Gary's behaviour. Everyone knew what he was doing. The difficulty is I wanted to understand the why, and the why was the influence the death his father had 12 months earlier when he died of cancer. I discovered that Gary was simply not able to deal with a raft of painful emotions and the trauma that resulted from his death. At last, Gary got to be understood and then was able to understand. Just as a little footnote, last October, just over 50 years after the event, I met Gary again at his home in North Queensland. Our meeting was recorded as part of a short documentary called The Cop from Wagga. Sadly, Gary is in palliative care, but he is eternally grateful I made the effort to reconnect with him. What my experience of developing restorative conferences for juvenile crime in Wagga, what made it unique was that practice preceded theory. It took 6 months of experimentation, bringing offenders, victims, and families together to develop a conference script and a set of restorative questions that remain unchanged today. My intuitive sense of good process allowed me to work out the practice capable of satisfying the emotional and psychological needs of all conference participants. I was, however, challenged. I was not able to explain the why the conference process worked. With others, I was fortunate to discover theories that provide a sound and logical explanation for why these conferences were always successful, regardless of the nature of the crime, number of participants, and so on. One of the theories was John Braithwaite's sociological theory about what he described as reintegrative shaming, in which he described the conditions needed for the successful re-entry of offenders. There was a strong resonance between the conference script and the rituals John described in his theory. As an aside, I should point out the difference between a routine and a ritual is that one has a soul. However, John's theory failed to adequately explain the consistent emotional dynamics we observed in these conferences. It was Sylvan Tompkins' theory, the psychology of affects, which filled this theoretical void. Ted had already mentioned the importance of encouraging the free expression of affect whilst minimising the negative, maximising the positive as a blueprint for building community. The restorative questions I developed create the conditions needed for the free expression of affects. Probably most significant about connecting theory to practice was that I was able to explicitly articulate my practice rationale, what I did, why I did that, why doing that worked, and how I knew. It allowed me to become more intentional, consistent, and impactful in my practice. I had developed a universal relational practice framework that I believe could be used in almost every domain of human endeavour, or as Ted would say, everyday life. Over nearly 3 decades, I've used this explicit restorative practice framework in a diverse range of applications with great success. Participatory processes such as community processing and citizen assembly are examples on the practice continuum that work because they satisfy the conditions that Tompkins and Nathanson prescribed as necessary for building relationships and healthy community. Finally, the key lesson from my restorative experiences recognises that our most fundamental human need is to be heard and understood, not to be right or wrong. Power of voice transcends the differences that individuals have in beliefs and opinion. Processes that employ open-ended Socratic questions, provide voice for all involved, and send a clear signal that every person's opinion matter. This is at the heart of why participatory processes work. And I'll finish it at that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Terry. And I'm going to invite all the panelists to come on to screen at this time. If you have questions, there's a question and answer feature. I would love to hear them, what you're thinking. You can also...
Gosh, I'm unable to start my video. I think you have to...
I've got to
Free
free
me.
you as well. Okay, give me a second here. All right. Well, actually, Ted, do you have a comment after listening to Terry and Linda, just in the sense of, you know, how this fits into your vision, what's happening, and how it explains maybe why these processes work?
Well, the general theme, of course, is expanding restorative, and that's been happening in many ways, even within the restorative justice movement, people that defined it, using that language. Actually, Linda was there at the same event, the European Forum for Restorative Justice in Tallinn, um, was a really, ama- having not gone since COVID, before COVID, really amazing how people keep pushing the applications of how they can use the strategies of bringing people together to resolve issues to new settings. And I think the vocabulary I'm proposing is really just meant to be liberating from the term justice, just not to, people can, have their own go at the definitional framework in that field. But I think on a larger sense, there's ways that we can look at it and have for the last many decades. But now I'm suggesting that we actually take it. I'm using the phrase from micro to macro. But notwithstanding, what Linda's doing is expanding it in terms of its intensity and depth and detail, and actually, getting a lot of experience. We're expanding the domain in that way, and I think Terry's, recapped in a sense where we've come from, his journey from simply using this with the kid with his mother in an incident where uh, he punched Terry in the face, and you can see how it's left the poor guy. I mean, so no revenge there. So he really, as a lot of people who come upon it, it matches what's in them. What feels like the right kind of way, respond, how to more effectively manage relationships. Linda uses terms like, self regulation to manage your natural responses of emotion and affect. And, it's all fitting together in a lot of very complex settings now. And so doing it in a workplace
Mhm.
effectively and with detail. And then, I guess I'm all excited about these new opportunities, and they're, as people will see who perhaps come to some of our future events, I hope, others on this, there are people doing some amazing work in different ways. And, I think Terry and Linda opened the door to some of those possibilities.
Yeah. We do welcome questions at this time, but Linda, I have a question for you. Just, I was struck by, on your graphic of the different domains that, you were starting with what the practices are, affective statements, circles, but that the intermediate was sort of the values or even the functions, trust, belonging, stewardship. Um, how does that fit in with all that we're talking about? Do you think that's relevant beyond the workplace to some of these sort of a more general theory of what it is when people do restorative practices?
Yeah, thanks for that, Josh. I think those are really, I think at the last Building a New Reality webinar, one of the questions was, what skills do people need, right, to do this work? And I think how we show up and how we develop and hone our own skills is critical. So how do we build trust? How do we make sure that people feel that they belong so that they will fully and honestly and authentically participate in society? And we are all stewards of our future, right? So when Ted speaks about the importance of expanding, it goes back to, Terry's work and relationship. We can use relationships to expand our impact. And the world's got some wicked problems right now, right? So, like, this is how we can do it with a relational approach, or we could do it with one that dominates and subjugates others. So, what I'm seeing is that it's not just Ted who's talking about the importance of expanding this work. The IRP graduate school, we have people really looking at how do we create systemic change with a new graduate certificate designed around that. There are things that need to have a more humane, compassionate approach. And I think to do that as individuals in relationship with others, we need how to learn how to create trust. We need how to create a sense of belonging in a very polarized world, right? And we are all stewards of our same future together. So I think those principles are, I don't know how they exist in large nation states. I hope someone else is doing that research, but I believe deeply that when we prime ourselves with those skill sets, we will have a better future.
Terry, you got any thoughts of reaction?
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Hmm?
Look, when I look back, the greatest difference was made when I understood the why of my practice. And look, in a very simple way, if we have an explicit relational practice framework, we have the essence of what it is, regardless of the application or the setting, a foundation on which to consciously, intentionally, consistently build relationships. The application is just limited by our imagination. And the difference when you have an explicit framework that you are able to articulate makes what you're on about so explicit you can share the language and the practice with those you're helping. So what I'm sort of arguing is that we need to move from the idea that restorative is unique, but it's germane to mainstream practice. The better and more aware we are of what we're doing and why we're doing it. You see, as a cop, I remember in 1992 when I was being asked by teachers if I'd come and talk to them. The first question I asked them is, what's the need? What's your practice void? And then I would say to them, tell me about your practice. How do you explain your practice rationale? They were good at telling me what they did, very uncertain about why they did it and why it worked. And the answer that I would hear all the time was when I'd say, ask them about their practice rationale was, we've never been asked that question. Now, if there's one takeaway from this webinar is the importance of being conscious and aware of what it is you're doing and why you're doing it.
There was a question from the folks in the audience about.
I wanted to mention.
Oh, you want to? Well,
No. I just didn't want us to forget it. Go on it.
yeah, about related really to the workplace. How these practices help things move from a hierarchical structure to more even distributed decision making. So I don't know. I think maybe we all have experience in that in some ways, but Linda, do you want to take that first?
I think, first of all, I don't think you have to explain a whole theory of restorative practice and justice to create those conditions, because most people, as Terry was saying, you want to feel heard, you want to feel valued, you want to feel like your opinion belongs. So I think for many times, there are people who are doing certain practices who don't have the language that we theorize, but they have it in their intentions. So in terms of, in workplaces, um, allowing people to make the decisions that matter most to them, that people along in their different realms know what's happening, and you can get out of their way and trust them. Will they make a mistake? Absolutely. Would I make a mistake? Absolutely. So we learn from those. So we have to create those high expectations and support so those mistakes aren't catastrophic. But people deserve the dignity to take risks, to try new things, and make decisions at all levels of an organization. And there will be some decisions that, you think of people out in the field of working with their clients, they don't have time to call the brain and say, what do I do? They need to know at that moment how to respond, and they will do that in the context of that relationship. So I think a lot of the ways that people make decisions in organizations has just historically become flatter and flatter as we move away from thinking that one person should know or is responsible for knowing everything.
And there are two elements also, segueing from what Linda's saying, that power is both authority and influence. And it's not always easy for bosses to give up the ultimate decision. But the more that they create settings where people can talk about things and share and discussing it begins to change. At first, they have influence, and ultimately, I think companies make a transition to more authority being shared. And I don't think it happens, just all of a sudden people decide to do that. But simple circles give people a chance to be heard, and that's the first step in just people getting understood and then getting trusted. And I think we're going through that process throughout society, hopefully at all levels of society, and whatever way you're doing it out there in webinar land, keep doing it.
Terry, do you see that happening, that where, these processes change that dynamic in different settings?
Let me just share a simple example of where I got involved with a fledgling youth organisation in 2010. I had 10 staff, headed by a young woman by the name of Kerry Sellen, who asked if I would come. And the first question I asked her and a colleague was, why have you asked me to come? They said, well, you're some sort of expert on restorative. We want you to tell you all about it. I said, look, what I'd like to do is to have a conversation with you about where you think restorative fits, what the need is. Tell me about what matters here. Tell me about your practice. What motivates you to do what you do? And about 100 questions later, they started to get an understanding that they were looking to restorative to fill a void they didn't and couldn't describe. Kerry had started the organisation on the basis of being, after 25 years in the industry, wanted to create a different experience and wasn't sure what it looked like. Now, what happened in the next 6 years, their staff increased to nearly 100 and was recognised by Business Review Weekly as the 6th best Australian workplace. I said to them, shut the windows and the doors, work out what a shared understanding of good practice looks like, work out why you do what you do, become explicit with that, have a shared understanding of how you build strong collegial relationships, and then go out and engage young people, vulnerable young people and their families in a very Socratic way, where they get to really understand the rationale for what you're doing and why you're doing it. If you do it in a way that's explicit, the language and the practice will become very obvious and will help them build their own relational capacity. I've got lots of examples of where change becomes possible. And I mean, we have to be careful we don't suffer from a paralysis by analysis. In other words, what does a good relational framework look like? What does a regular conversation look like that's likely to draw people in rather than push them away? And what happens is our differences are all transcended when we're connected at an emotional level.
All right, I'm looking at the clock and we are at the end of our time. But if you want to stay with us, we are going to move to another room. But in case you can't, we really appreciate your being here. We're going to send out a link as soon as possible for the recording. And you will be rolled over to the next webinar in the series next month, October 16th. It's going to be Restorative Communities with Kara Bolton, who's the author of the Restorative Communities book that Banner published a couple years ago now, and two folks from Gloucestershire, UK, Ben Fisk and Inger Britt Lewater. So we're really excited to have you as part of this series. Thank you to our guests, Terry O'Connell, Linda Kligman, and Ted and I will be over at the other room if you'd like to join us.